It's that time of the year when awards are given out and think pieces penned to celebrate the best that the past 12 months had to offer. And quite the year it has been. So why is it that when I look back at 2023, it feels more like a year defined by bad games than good ones? The obvious answer would be that maybe this year just sucked. And hey, as my parents like to say, we can't all be winners. Sometimes you do just suck. I mean, sometimes years just suck. And yeah, that would explain it. Except, it turns out, 2023 did not suck, for video games at least. Nor was it mid, somewhat below average, or even slightly above par. In fact, it wasn't good, it wasn't great, it wasn't even excellent. It was, by objective metrics, one of the best years in gaming history, and easily the best of the last decade, with more games receiving a Metacritic score above 90 than any other in the past 20 years, and more games in the high 80s as well. It's also the first time in a while that the question everyone seems to place so much importance on, of what was the game of the year, actually has a real range of viable answers rather than the usual one or two. And it's not just about big releases either. There have been plenty of notable indie and mid-budget titles, and even the genres receiving acclaim show more diversity than the usual cinematic action or open-world game domination of most years, with highly acclaimed turn-based RPGs, survival horror games, fighting games, 2D platformers, and more. You can debate the finer details if you like, but one thing you can't do is say that 2023 was a bad year for games. So why did bad games still seem to monopolize so much of media and content creation this year? Why are we all so obsessed with bad video games? Well, how much time do you have? And how much would you like to know? Because the history of bad games runs deep, and our relationship with them seems complicated. Bad games have come a long way, and there's no better place to start this exploration than the present. Because, yeah, 2023 was certainly a good year for good games, but it wasn't exactly a bad year for bad games either. Depending on what exactly you mean by bad. It probably comes as no surprise, but it's still worth repeating that there are a lot of video games out there, and more are released each day. Statistics from 2022 put the number of new games released on Steam alone at over 34 a day, and that is a number that has long been increasing. So, with so many games existing, and the low barrier of entry presented by modern game development and modern distribution methods, it's only logical that some of those games, maybe even most of them, will be bad by most measurable metrics. Many will be made by small teams or solo developers with little if any budget, sometimes more as a way to learn game development than make money, and of those trying to make money, there will be plenty of asset flips and bait and switches that are just trying to eke out minimal profit from less than minimal effort. This is just the gaming world we live in today, and there are advantages to this situation as well, as the low barrier of entry can sometimes lead to gold. I'd say that the Undertales and Obra Dinns of the world more than make up for the large number of lesser quality games that might exist alongside them somewhere in the shadows of the Steam storefront. And so, much like the large number of cockroaches at your local favourite fast food joint, this wealth of genuinely bad games tend to exist out of sight and out of mind, even if deep down we're still aware that they're out there. Now, some rare individuals might not be content to just ignore this rich selection of gaming's least noteworthy offerings, and might partake in the practice of Steam dumpster diving to actively seek out the worst of the worst. This is an activity presumably usually done to create content out of, rather than for the merits of the games themselves, but if one does find themselves with a taste for trash, Steam is not a bad place to get your fill, due to the 2-hour refund policy that allows you to play and not pay, as well as the abundant amount of choice. Generally though, these kinds of low quality, low budget and low importance games do little to truly satisfy the bad game enthusiasts of the world. No, what truly separates the spoiled cream from the crop are those much rarer examples of games that are bad despite their budget. Games that once showed promise, that come from established entities, or that carry a certain symbolic importance. These are the bad games that history remembers. But even amongst these, there are still many recognizable characteristics and patterns that differentiate one type of bad video game from another. The first group that comes to mind is generic shovelware, i.e., lower budget games that do just about enough to go beyond Steam to find their way to more exclusive storefronts or even retail shelves, where they then hope that their low quality might go unnoticed until after purchase. Examples will often include games aimed at children, more casual or party-focused games, and entries into lesser-known sports series or genres where there might be a general lack of competition. These games often seem to target the type of consumer who doesn't check review scores to begin with, and so will be unswayed by critical consensus. And once upon a time, these games made up a significant part of the industry. Now though, retail sales have declined and consumer awareness has risen, so shovelware might not be as profitable as it once was, which 2023 reflects. Maybe examples like Everybody 1-2 Switch still do enough to seem noteworthy due to their combination of low quality despite the direct involvement of a big name like Nintendo, but really there's just too much competition in the bad game arena for games that are only notable for being bad to really stand out, whether they get a retail release or not. One way for a bad game to go beyond the generic shovelware tier is to cash in on a pre-existing intellectual property. Licensed games have a long history of dubious quality, and the reason is similar to games already discussed, except rather than trying to fill small holes in the market or appeal to less informed consumers, licensed games instead also rely on the appeal of the IP being enough to sell the game regardless of quality. You might think that major media juggernauts like The Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, or Marvel may wish to preserve the sanctity of their billion-dollar brands by avoiding tying them to dumpster fire games, but apparently that's never been much of a concern, and so the quality of a license and the quality of a licensed game have long showed little correlation. Bad licensed games are also not as common as they once were, but 2023 still has a few that truly went above and beyond the lowest of expectations. Like Skull Island: Rise of Kong, an action-adventure beat-em-up where you play as everyone's second favourite oversized ape. Long has King Kong been forced to live in the shadow of his more successful, yet not quite copyright-infringing gaming compatriot Donkey Kong, and long shall he remain there, I guess. Described by IGN as ugly, full of bugs and boring, by PC Gamer as barely playable, and by Steam as psychological horror and hentai, Skull Island: Rise of Kong stands out for being even worse than a typical bad game, as well as failing as a movie tie-in if that was the intent, because the movie came out in 2017. Still, for publisher Game Mill Entertainment, this was only one of several awful licensed games that released this year, with other gems including Avatar: The Last Airbender: Quest for Balance, and The Walking Dead: Destinies, both of which managed the impressive feat of going toe-to-toe with Rise of Kong for the crown of Worst Licensed Game of the Year. And so, the addition of a license can elevate the noteworthiness of a bad game. However, the effect of this is still often rather limited because bad licensed games have been around for years, and expectations for them have long been set low. Yes, it can still feel insulting to fans of the original IP to see their beloved franchise aggressively manhandled in such a way, but these days beloved franchises being mistreated isn't exactly a new thing, or something exclusive to video games.
You look like a cut of fuckable meat, are you?
So, if you want to really insult a fanbase through the badness of a game, a better method might be to target fanbases of pre-existing games, like with a good old reboot or revival. The great advantage of this method is you don't need access to the largest fanbases or biggest franchises, because if anything, the older and more forgotten the franchise is, the more insulting its mistreatment becomes. Like, imagine this, just imagine, if you took one of the most historically important and influential games of all time, like, I don't know, Colossal Cave Adventure, the text-based adventure game developed by Will Crowther and Don Woods in 1976 for their PDP-10 mainframe computer. The game that arguably launched the entire adventure game genre and remains a major landmark for interactive fiction to this day. Imagine if you remade something like that as a modern game in 2023 and the result was just really, really bad. Yeah, I know what you're thinking, that does sound pretty unbelievable, and yet, obviously, it's happened already, if you couldn't tell where I'm going here. Say hello to 2023's Colossal Cave, a game that really didn't need to exist, and yet, at least if you look at who developed this, it's clear that it wasn't just a cynical corporate cash grab, it was just bad. But if you do want some soulless corporatism to spice up your bad franchise revival, then don't worry, because good old reliable Ubisoft have got you covered. The Settlers was a long-running and much-enjoyed city-building and real-time strategy game with a light-hearted aesthetic that always lived a little in the shadow of genre compatriots like SimCity or Civilization. The series has had its ups and downs over the years, with its last entry being the still well-reviewed Settlers 7 in 2010. Until 2023's The Settlers' New Allies, that is, which was not well-reviewed, and in addition to being a lackluster take on Settlers gameplay, was also buggy and laggy. The longer fans have to wait for a sequel, the greater the slap to the face is when that sequel disappoints. But if Settlers fans felt they were slapped hard this year, know that it could have been worse. Flashback was a much-loved cult classic cinematic platformer from 1992. Flashback 2, on the other hand, was a mistake from 2023 that received a 36 out of 100 on Metacritic and was described by reviewers as a complete failure, depressingly awful, and a disaster in almost every respect. And if low quality and long waits aren't enough, one final method to really rub salt in a fanbase's wounds is to add in some aggressive monetization as well, as is the case with Konami's recently released free-to-play interactive story thing, Silent Hill Ascension. And hey, people have been asking for a new Silent Hill for years, so here you go, enjoy. The Battle Pass is only $20. You don't want to miss out on your exclusive Silent Hill emojis, do you? And so, while bad licensed games do provide a solid starting point for elevating a bad game, bad franchise revivals and sequels definitely offer higher potential in maximizing impact. And yet, if maximizing impact is the goal, nothing is as effective as using established developers to create higher expectations and generate real hype, only to then deliver disaster. And it's here that 2023 really started hitting its stride. The year began with Forspoken, from well-known publisher Square Enix, and a development team formed from those responsible for well-known game, Final Fantasy XV, in addition to several other big industry names like writer Amy Hennig, the creator and original director of the well-known Uncharted series. Forspoken was an open-world action RPG with a heavy focus on traversal mechanics and strong visuals, but its story and gameplay received much criticism, with its dialogue in particular coming under heavy scrutiny online for its perceived cringiness.
I just move shit with my freaking mind! Yeah, okay, that is something I do now.
Forspoken received mixed critic reviews, worse user reviews, and only a month after its release, its developer was dissolved by Square Enix. Compared to earlier games, Forspoken is of a higher quality, but compared to the circumstances which surround these games, it can also be considered a much greater disappointment. Unlike others, it had a large budget and an experienced developer, with trailers that were shown off at major gaming events to create genuine expectations that it might be good, and this all helped to make its failure that much more special. A similar situation can be seen with the later released Redfall, a vampire-themed multiplayer looter shooter from developer Arcane, of Deathloop, Prey and Dishonored fame, published by Bethesda Softworks and promoted by parent company Microsoft, who were clearly positioning the game as a flagship release for their much-pushed subscription service Xbox Game Pass. Unfortunately for all involved, Redfall bombed, receiving an even lower critic score than Forspoken, with poor enemy AI and technical issues highlighted as some of its most glaring issues, and a dismally low estimated player count, ensuring that it would go down as a major commercial failure as well as a critical one. Now, really, if we're being honest with ourselves, it's obvious that neither Redfall nor Forspoken even come close to being the worst game of the year if quality is all that matters. But clearly, quality isn't the only thing that matters. And it's here we come to an important philosophical question that is at the heart of bad game discourse. Which is, what's more important? How bad the game actually is, or the circumstances which surround it? Generally speaking, the attention a bad game receives correlates directly to the number of people it disappoints, rather than how bad it truly is, and this makes sense because who cares about a bad game that nobody cares about? While on the other hand, the more people that care about something, the more reason there becomes to care about it. We live in a society, and so people become personally invested, others start to take notice as well, the badness of the game becomes a story, content is created about it, the fallout is further reaching due to the higher stakes, the story then possibly grows even more to take on a life of its own, and within this is surely where much of the appeal of bad games lies. And if bad games are a story, disappointment seems like it might be the key ingredient. But the question then becomes, where should the line be drawn between a bad game and a disappointing game? This leads us to the next type of bad game, the disappointments. A more controversial category where the lines are unclear and people frequently disagree, but a category that derives a lot of attention and so deserves a lot to be mentioned. For an example of such a game, look no further than Diablo IV, the long-awaited action RPG sequel from Blizzard Entertainment. Diablo's fourth mainline entry received near-universal critical acclaim, with an 86 on Metacritic and an even higher score on consoles. And yet, not everyone agreed with this assessment, with the user score sitting at a rather contrasting 2.2. So, what is Diablo IV? On the one hand, you have IGN describing the game as a spectacular sequel, and Windows Central calling it Blizzard's magnum opus, and yet, according to Metacritic user Ilum1Nat, it is very bad, very badvery. Hang on, let me pull up the rest. Yeah, of course. Badvery, bad. So, who are you going to listen to? Is the game spectacular, or is it badvery? And this is the beauty of the disappointments category. Really, it's up to you. A game can be bad if you want it to be, or it can be a masterpiece, and maybe even a masterpiece that normal consumers are too dumb to appreciate, or a bad game that critics are too dumb to see through, meaning not only are you justified in liking or disliking something, but also that you're better than everyone else who thinks differently to you. 2023 had many such disappointments. Some disappointed a small number of vocal dislikers while pleasing most, like Final Fantasy XVI. Some became a proxy for people's console allegiance, like Starfield. Some were disappointing in an expected way, like EA Sports FC 24. And some were expected to be disappointing, and yet still managed to be more disappointing than the low bar expected of them, like Overwatch 2 and Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. Are these all bad games? Well, maybe, but maybe not, and maybe some, or maybe none. It all depends on how you define bad game and who you ask, but one thing that is for sure is that many people are calling these games bad, and while opinions can get exaggerated, the disappointment around them is still real. Disappointments matter, but there is still one final main category that might surpass even them: the baffling. The why was this even made and how did this happen type of game. This might be the rarest and most desirable category of all. Unlike the disappointments, these games tend to be bad in an uncontroversial way where there's no risk of upsetting anyone by criticizing them, And yet, unlike for normal shovelware, bad license games, or failed franchise revivals, these games are not a regular occurrence, and instead possess a unique quality which makes them stand out and demands that people take notice of them. Take 2023's crime boss Rockay City. On the surface, it's a poorly made Payday clone where players work together to complete various heist-type missions. This makes it seem anything but notable, but then you see its cast. With Michael Madsen playing the lead role and support from the likes of Chuck Norris, Danny Trejo, Danny Glover, Kim Basinger, Vanilla Ice, and more, it means this game has an absolutely star-studded lineup of somewhat washed-up celebrities. Given the 90s setting, however, and the exaggerated crime boss premise, it makes this cast a strangely perfect fit for this type of game. Except they're delivering performances like this.
Let's end it here today.
That would be Sheriff Goddamn fucking Norris.
That's it. We end this.
Yeah.
Charge.
And it's not just the performances. The voice direction, script, and the entire premise all work together to create something that is so bad, some might consider it good. Or just something so bad that it becomes interesting. I mean, bad games come out all the time, but it's rare for a bad game to bring down so many other big names alongside it. Rockay City's notoriety was likely limited by its lack of a Steam release, which is always a risky move for a multiplayer game, and it also didn't involve the downfall of any big name developer, with it instead being the first game of the newly formed in-game studios. This might also answer the question of how this game came to be. The studio behind it were inexperienced. They knew that one of the hardest parts of getting started in the industry is simply getting your game noticed amidst so much competition, and so they spent a lot of their budget on the celebrity cast, but in the end weren't able to create a game that matched their ambitions. Game development is hard, and money and time can and often do run out. Good voice acting also requires more than just good actors, and what we see in game might be the result of poor direction and general inexperience with a production like this. So while crime boss Rockay City is bad, it still only manages to baffle on a surface level, which is sufficient to make it the flavour of the month for a while, but not enough to leave a truly lasting legacy up there with the real giants of bad video games. Luckily though, 2023 would manage to produce a giant of its own. Gollum. Yes, as giants go, he may be on the smaller side, but a very small man-hobbit thing can still cast a large shadow, and the Lord of the Rings Gollum has done just that. This is a shining example of the most exclusive and elusive type of bad game. A game so bad that people struggle to understand it, and so bad that they can't help but pay attention to it. Gollum is the bad game your girlfriend told you not to worry about. A game so bad that it will leave its mark on gaming history and be remembered long after many better games have been forgotten. But we'll come back to Gollum later. He's not going anywhere. In the interest of thoroughness, I suppose we must at least acknowledge that there are other categories of bad games that could be mentioned. One of which might be a new entry to the group that has put forward a strong case for inclusion based on a stellar 2023 performance. The bad PC port. Yes, once upon a time, it was console ports that suffered, while the PC master race sipped grape-flavoured energy drinks high above in their water-cooled towers. But not anymore. In a year that provided many examples suggesting a problem systemic in nature, the worst offenders were easily The Last of Us Part 1 and Star Wars Jedi Survivor, which could both only be described as broken on PC at release. As far as types of bad games go, this one is hardly the most interesting, and it's debatable whether a good game with a bad port even qualifies to begin with, but it's certainly been a noteworthy trend of gaming in 2023, and I guess the irony does add to the situation. I mean, who's the master race now, PC players? I.e., most of my audience who are watching this right now, including me. Yeah, all that time waiting on GPU prices to come back down for your new build, and then this happens. Not so smart now, are we? yeah, hopefully this trend doesn't continue. Another debatable category is cancelled games, a subject gamers love to romanticize with wistful thoughts of what could have been and accusing fingers pointed at pesky publishers, but the reality is, games get cancelled for a reason, and if time and money do run out, then a cancelled game might be better than a bad one. At the very least though, bad games and cancelled games do have something important in common, with the main difference often coming down to a single decision. Usually though, this is a decision made behind closed doors and made earlier rather than later, but 2023 does provide at least one example where this wasn't the case. Hyenas from Total War developer Creative Assembly and publisher Sega was an online multiplayer extraction shooter that was basically finished. It had a closed beta where many people played the game, plenty of money was spent on marketing it, and it was reported to be Creative Assembly's and Sega's highest budget game of all time. And yet, just months before its expected release, Sega made the decision to cancel the game entirely, citing concerns around its profitability. If a bad game is measured by its degree of failure, then a major publisher's most expensive game ever made, not even making it to release despite being effectively finished, is a near unprecedented level of failure. It is catastrophic for the developers involved if no one else, and it raises the important question of how many other bad games have been stolen from the world by cancellations. After all, if a game is so bad it needs to be cancelled, it suggests it might be even worse than the bad games that do release. And if this is true, how many terrible masterpieces might we have been denied over the years? What tragedy there might be if the most tragic games of all never even get a chance to be seen. Or maybe the world has enough bad games already, I don't know. Finally though, we reach the last category I'm going to mention, which is the deliberately bad game, the most confusing and hardest to provide clear examples of type. These are games that feature elements usually considered to be bad design on purpose for positive effect, like for humour or a sense of irony or surrealism and so on, to ultimately blur the distinction between good and bad altogether. 2023 does not provide many examples of this, but one classic case would be 2010's Deadly Premonition, a game that received a 2 out of 10 from IGN and a 10 out of 10 from Destructoid. When you watch a cutscene in Deadly Premonition and it has bad audio mixing, while the in-game characters also struggle to hear each other, is this bad design, good design, or something else entirely? Who knows, but this does introduce a paradox, where if a game is bad on purpose and that is part of what makes it enjoyable, then surely it is not actually bad to begin with, and so does not count as a type of bad game. Regardless, deliberately bad games seem at least worthy of acknowledging, so here you go. And those are all the main types of bad video games that exist today, courtesy of 2023, a good year for bad games. Depending on what you mean by good and bad. Still, this was far from the only year bad games would leave their mark on gaming. Bad games matter. In the early 70s, before gaming had even reached its infancy, the then newly created Atari took some inspiration from tennis on the Magnavox Odyssey to create Pong. And gaming was never the same. But Atari weren't the only ones taking inspiration that decade. The unprecedented success of Pong led to an entire era of Pong clones, where hundreds upon hundreds of cheaply made home Pong consoles flooded the market in the space of a couple years as every electronic company and new startup around tried desperately to cash in on the hot new craze that was video games. The result was complete market saturation. Soon a second generation of home consoles appeared that offered more than just Pong, but the damage was already done. Consumers lost confidence, retailers struggled to shift stock, and Magnavox filed lawsuits, all of which resulted in the video game crash of 1977. Pong was not a bad game, but its hundreds of cheap imitations were, and they temporarily brought the entire industry down around them. So, at the birth of gaming, bad games were serious business, and did as much to shape the industry as good ones. The video game crash of 1977 is sometimes forgotten about due to it being overshadowed by the much larger crash of 1983, but both had similar causes. The gaming industry bounced back in the late 70s after the success of several arcade classics alongside new cartridge-based home consoles like the Atari 2600, but then Activision broke away from Atari to become the first third-party developer. In response, Atari tried to sue, but failed, thus legitimizing the practice of third-party development, and within a few years, third-party games were everywhere. Companies rushed to cash in on the once more growing market by producing cheap, poorly made games that filled retail shelves. Consumers then had no way to determine the quality of these games without buying them, and once people started getting burnt, they stopped buying. This was a time before the internet, before many reviews, and before established names had been established. Consumers simply weren't protected, and everyone paid the price. The one hope should have been Atari themselves. They were the ones that brought the home console market back from the brink with the 2600, the ones who had created hit titles like Asteroids, and the ones who were in that period the fastest growing company in American history. And they were the face of the gaming industry. But even Atari made bad games. The most famous is 1982's E.T. the Extraterrestrial, an adventure game adaptation of the then recently released Spielberg movie that had a rushed development designed around getting the game to retail shelves for the holiday season that year. E.T. had confusing gameplay, received bad reviews, and would go on to become symbolic of all that was wrong with the industry at the time, with it frequently being cited as one of the worst games ever made and one of the greatest failures in gaming. But E.T. was a bit of a scapegoat. The awful 1982 Pac-Man port for the 2600, which failed spectacularly to recreate the popular arcade classic on the less powerful Atari home console, likely did more to damage consumer confidence in the industry, and there were plenty of other examples like this too. The important point to take away from this event, however, isn't about how bad these games may or may not have been, but more about how much they sold. Pac-Man for the 2600 may well be the worst game Atari ever made, and yet it was also the best-selling. And amidst so many bad games, with so little quality control and so few ways for consumers to differentiate the good ones, the industry couldn't cope. Atari went from the fastest growing company in history to being given away for no profit, while the entire American gaming market entered a multi-year-long hibernation as onlookers declared gaming to be a fad now coming to its natural conclusion. Home consoles wouldn't make a comeback until the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985, and when they did, Nintendo went to great lengths to try to avoid the mistakes of the past, with a much stricter licensing system that required approval from Nintendo themselves, as well as the official Nintendo seal of quality to allow consumers to differentiate approved Nintendo games from bootlegs, and Nintendo would even create a lockout chip on the NES to try to prevent unauthorized games from being playable. The result was the establishment of a standard level of quality for console games that has largely remained ever since, and with this, the reign of terror bad games had on the industry was over. But bad games still existed. Quality is relative after all, and just because games were now being checked to ensure that they were playable and reflective of what was being advertised on the box, this didn't mean all games were automatically good. The 8-bit era was also a time when video games were infamously difficult, and so the bad games of this time period tended to be the ones that combined high difficulty with unintuitive, awkward, or confusing design elements. Take Dragon's Lair on the NES, a game famous for most players not even being able to work out how to make it past the first screen, with anything and everything you might try leading to a quick death. Other games might specialize in bad controls, or convoluted gameplay systems, or a lack of player direction. Perhaps the best overall representative of bad games of this era was American toy company turned gaming publisher LJN. Shortly after entering the world of gaming, LJN was bought by another gaming company, Acclaim. But as Nintendo only allowed third parties to release a limited number of games on their system as a form of quality control, it meant that Acclaim ended up using LJN to bypass this rule. As a result, LJN managed to publish an extensive library that includes many of the NES's worst games, including the Uncanny X-Men, Friday the 13th, Back to the Future 2 and 3, and more. It was through this era that the association with licensed games and a lack of quality started to be enshrined, but this was also a time when many good developers and good series started to get the name recognition they deserved, and so perhaps for this reason, some of the most infamous bad games of the following years became the ones which came from developers or series people expected better from. Some classic examples of this are the 1994 Zelda games, as well as Hotel Mario for the Philips CDI. These games were the strange result of an agreement between Philips and Nintendo over the once-planned CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo. In the end, this add-on wasn't released, but several Philips-developed Nintendo games were, and they didn't have much in common with the originals in style or quality. Still, at least they provided a unique glimpse inside the minds of several of Nintendo's most iconic characters.
Nice of the princess to invite us over for a picnic, eh, Luigi? I hope she made lots of spaghetti. Luigi, look!
Gee, it sure is boring around here.
My boy, this piece is what all true warriors strive for.
I just wonder what Ganon's up to.
And if even Mario and Zelda aren't immune to the threat of bad games, maybe no series was. Although some did seem more vulnerable than others. Like Sonic, which seemed to go through an extended period of continuously trying to reach new lows, with 2005's Shadow the Hedgehog, followed by Sonic 06, Sonic Riders, Sonic Unleashed, and more. Many more, actually, making it almost impressive how consistently bad this once great franchise became for a time, and it was a time that lasted for a while. If only Sega had murdered Sonic sooner, or just asked for help from the fans. For the most part, however, the 90s and the early 2000s was a time when the gaming industry was maturing as it grew, with the cost of game development gradually rising and space on retail shelves becoming more competitive, making it harder for truly terrible games to sneak their way into unsuspecting customers' hands. As the saying goes, however, where there's a will, there's a way, and some terrible games still ended up in places they shouldn't be. Like 2003's Big Rigs Over the Road Racing, which holds the record for the lowest ever score of any video game in history on Metacritic, with 8 out of 100. And if that score doesn't sound that bad, consider that many publications have a minimum score of 1, making it a real achievement for a game to get an aggregate score of less than 10. Big Rigs is broken. There's zero collision detection, the AI can't even be bothered to race against you and instead just sits there on the starting line. You can leave the in-game map, and when you go in reverse you can continually accelerate, allowing you to reach a maximum speed of 1.23 times 10 to the power of 37 miles per hour, which is many quintillion times the speed of light. If one were to look for the worst game of all time, Big Rigs is not a bad contender, as while it's not the only broken game ever made, it is broken to an impressive degree, and yet still managed to defy the odds with a retail release and professional review coverage. This raises the question of how did this game release in such a state to begin with, and the answer is that the official American developer, Stellar Stone, were outsourcing game development to Eastern Europe, which was where a small team actually made Big Rigs, and yet that team was only able to reach a pre-alpha state before publisher Game Mill decided to ship it. Hopefully, alarm bells are ringing in the heads of the most astute listeners now, because that publisher has shown up in this video already. GameMill are still around today, as 2023's Avatar: Quest for Balance, Skull Island: Rise of Kong, and The Walking Dead Destinies all readily testify, and hey, I guess you can't say they don't know what they're doing. In their own words, GameMill Entertainment have established a proven track record for leveraging the equity of some of the world's most beloved brands in the $100 billion video game market. And who doesn't love a little bit of leveraged equity? Most of the games GameMill have published over the years have been licensed games, and clearly, on some level, this is an effective strategy for them, which is likely due to the effectiveness of licenses when targeting certain parts of the market. And for a long time, licensed games were probably the best bet for finding a new bad game. In fact, for many years, all major blockbuster movies would come with an obligatory movie tie-in game. Sometimes one movie would even have multiple completely different games designed to cover every available platform. For example, 2002 movie Star Wars: Attack of the Clones had 6 games spanning genres as diverse as real-time strategy, space combat, third-person shooter, and side-scrolling action. Unsurprisingly, movie tie-in games like this often disappointed. Originally, these games were mostly conceived as marketing tools to bring more attention to the more important movies in an era where game development was cheap. These games were also often made on a strict deadline so that they could fulfill their purpose of tying in. That said, not every movie game was bad, and some were great, but the median quality was certainly below average, and for many years, bad movie games remained a consistent part of the industry, from E.T. on the Atari to Captain America Super Soldier all the way in 2011. In the 2010s, this would finally start to change, however, as gaming evolved once more, shifting the nature of bad games with it. One of the main drivers for this was game development continuing to get more expensive, pushing traditional development towards a more risk-averse AAA model, while at the same time small-budget indie games started to flourish to fulfill the role of catering to specific niches. This caused a general decline in middle-budget games, and made it harder for cheaply made games to compete on retail shelves at full price to dupe unsuspecting customers. The internet also brought increased awareness of game quality through things like unedited gameplay footage on platforms like YouTube or Twitch, which provided a much clearer indicator of quality than back-of-the-box screenshots, while the popularity of video reviews and social media brought critical consensus to a wider audience. Digital distribution did provide a new market for low-quality games, but the biggest platform, Steam, would also include easily noticeable user reviews and an easy-to-use refund system to provide some consumer protection. This didn't stop a whole load of terrible games appearing on Steam once the floodgates opened, but the combined result of all these changes were that even though more objectively bad games would be released in the 2010s than any other decade, the role these terrible games played was more limited, as consumers increasingly knew what they were buying. Still, the biggest change to bad games in this era might be how they came to be weaponized. For years, bad games were bad because of a lack of quality. They were cheaply made, had dated visuals, confusing or clunky gameplay, and so on. In the 2010s, however, bad games increasingly became games that were symbolic of problems players care about, and a lack of quality became less important than player anger and disappointment. One of the earliest, most important, and yet most forgotten examples of this was the 2011 MMO Star Wars: The Old Republic, from BioWare and EA. This was a time when World of Warcraft was still a gaming giant, and The Old Republic was positioned as one in a long line of much-touted WoW killers. But The Old Republic wasn't just the next big thing for MMOs, it was also estimated at the time to be the most expensive video game ever made. This was a massive game with a massive marketing campaign where BioWare and EA were doing all they could to generate hype in the run-up to its release. But the hype train wouldn't go exactly as planned, as a vocal anti-hype campaign flourished alongside it that can perhaps best be described by the moniker non-believers used for the game: Tortanic. For those who weren't there, Tortanic is a portmanteau of the Old Republic's initials and the name of the once unsinkable ship, the Titanic. The nickname suggested that this most expensive game of all time would meet a similar fate of sinking spectacularly, as other once promising MMOs had done before it. The key to understanding the Tortanic saga, however, is understanding that many people actively wanted this game to fail, long before it was actually released. The reasons for why they wanted this are varied, but include anger at the direction the once-loved studio BioWare seemed to be moving under the guidance of new owner EA, anger at the long-awaited sequel to the single-player RPG Knights of the Old Republic being an MMO, a genre not everyone enjoyed, and anger and complicated loyalties within the MMO community over the failure of so many WoW killers already, where MMO fans were getting sick of seeing hyped-up MMOs fail to deliver on promises, while possibly also being loyal to certain already existing MMOs. MMOs are a uniquely volatile genre. If everyone believes an MMO will fail, players won't want to invest lots of time into them. MMO players also often play the game their friends are playing, so the opinion of other people is even more important. And MMOs at this time relied on subscription models, meaning long-term engagement was necessary for success and growth. Basically, no genre relied more on hype and could be so heavily damaged by negativity. And for this reason, the Tortanic movement was a big deal. In the end, the Old Republic released 2 positive critic reviews and more critical user reviews, where it then had a rocky first year that would see it switch to free-to-play, after which it enjoyed a long life as a solid and stable if somewhat unremarkable example of a struggling genre. So it was neither the WoW killer that BioWare and EA claimed it to be, or the sinking ship prophesized by non-believers. It was just the game, worse than the hype and better than the hate. But its reputation as bad surely impacted its trajectory. As the decade went on, more and more examples like this can be seen. Take 2013's SimCity, a subpar entry into the classic city-building series. SimCity 2013 drew heavy criticism before release after it was announced that it would require constant online connectivity with no offline mode included. The game then released with severe server instability, making it unplayable for many and drawing even more criticism. The end result was the closure of the studio behind the game by parent company EA, and the end of the once legendary SimCity series. This was also the year that EA won an award for Worst Company in America, and the failure of SimCity 2013 also prompted rival company Paradox Interactive to greenlight a city builder of their own, which went on to become the critically and commercially successful Cities Skylines. SimCity was more than just a bad game. It was a representation of player dissatisfaction towards major gaming publishers, and its failure had a lasting impact. Other bad games of the decade were more political in nature. Gamergate was a thing that happened, and it was mostly focused around groups and individuals instead of games, but one exception to this was 2013 walking sim Gone Home, which received very positive critic reviews but much more mixed user reviews, while coming to represent the arguments on both sides of the Gamergate movement. Those on the anti-Gamergate side said the game was disliked due to its lack of traditional or masculine video game elements and LGBT-focused story, while those on the pro side said that reviewers being friends with the developers represented a conflict of interest and showed corruption in the gaming media. And so discussions that took place around whether this was a bad game or modern masterpiece likely had more to do with the people's political affiliation than the actual quality of the game. And for an example of the inverse of this, there is Hatred, a 2015 isometric shoot-'em-up where the player takes on the role of a mass killer fighting against all of humanity. If gunning down innocent civilians wasn't controversial enough, Hatred's creator also described the game as a reaction to modern trends in the industry, like political correctness. This helped it to garner huge amounts of negative media coverage, vastly disproportionate to the size or budget of the actual game, before Hatred was released to a scathing critical reception, making it one of the worst reviewed games of that year. And yet, Hatred is sitting at a very positive rating on Steam, with over 14,000 user reviews, suggesting that this small game actually sold incredibly well. For comparison, this is more user reviews than the multi-Game of the Year winning critical darling, Gone Home. Hatred was a game which harnessed the culture war for attention, and was rewarded for doing so, as every time the media called it one of the worst games ever made, it likely sold a few more copies. For a game with nothing to lose and little marketing to begin with, this kind of controversial bad game reputation seemed to be quite profitable. Many bad games were less political, but no less meaningful. No Man's Sky became the de facto representative of excessive hype and disingenuous marketing in 2016. High-profile Kickstarter failures like Mighty No. 9 proved that crowdfunding alone isn't enough to ensure a game is good. 2017 Star Wars Battlefront 2 ignited impassioned discussions over the role of microtransactions and pay-to-win monetization, which even reached governmental regulators over concerns that loot boxes might represent a form of gambling. 2018's Fallout 76 and 2020's Cyberpunk 2077 showcase the dangers of releasing games too early in a state that seems unfinished. And games like Warcraft 3 Reforged and GTA The Trilogy The Definitive Edition showed off just how much worse an improved version of an older game could be. Some of these games are bad in the traditional sense, some of them aren't, and yet all could be said to be bad in their own way, and all represented more than just a lack of quality. Whether that is the result of socio-political issues, the importance of game preservation, the dangers of over-monetization, misleading marketing, consumer loyalty, game development challenges, or something else. As a result, calling something bad is no longer an impartial observation. Increasingly, it's a targeted statement, a challenge, a call for action, or cry for attention. The gaming industry has changed over the years, and not always for the better. And for the most part, this isn't something players have much control over. The only power people do have is that given to them by their wallets, and that of their opinions. And as cases like Star Wars The Old Republic suggest, collective opinion does have power. It can raise games up, or tear them down, and it can backfire, or lead to studios closing down, or create new games, or improved games, or downward spirals, or new laws, and more. The role of bad games has changed. Once upon a time, low-quality games almost choked the life out of the entire industry, but these days they're barely a threat at all. Gaming is a billion-dollar business that shows every sign of being mature and stable, and consumers tend to know what they're getting themselves into. And yet, bad games are still important, because they've come to be more than games which lack quality. They're games which symbolize other problems, the problems people care about but don't have much control over. And now that bad games are about more than quality, what is and isn't a bad game isn't so clear-cut anymore. Which brings us to the role of the media. Negativity sells. I can't tell you exactly why. Maybe it's just something hardwired into our fallible human psyche. But regardless, you don't need to know why to know it's true. In the online age, the evidence is all around us, and gaming coverage is no exception. Take top 10 lists. It's well known that on YouTube, top 10 worst games of the year videos tend to get more views than the best game equivalents, even though bad games should, in theory, be less important. Or what about the constant stream of gaming is dying, modern games are boring, why aren't games fun anymore videos that all seem to follow a standard template with nothing new to add and yet still always find a sizable audience? Or go check any review channel that covers both good and bad games and look which get the most views and how big the difference tends to be. Or what about gaming news? What stories seem to get the most coverage and how are issues framed? Or what about the amount of videos that talk about the worst games? There's even Mr. Beast videos on worst ever video games, and I'm not sure you can get better proof of a subject's strong algorithmic viability than that. Hell, even discussions about good games seem to increasingly involve negativity, as if the only way people are able to establish that one game is good is by constantly making comparisons to all the bad games it's better than. Negativity sells, and the media, YouTubers or otherwise, are here to make money. Still, maybe the media and content creators are the wrong ones to blame, because it's not like they really chose for it to be this way. I mean, hello, look around. The inmates are running the asylum. It's the viewers who are really in charge, and everyone else is just trying to give those viewers what they want. And what they want is blood. Or at least to get to laugh at bad games while repeatedly seeing their dislike for AAA games and large publishers validated, all while they feel better than other people for having the designated right opinions. But hey, don't feel attacked. I'm saying this is normal, not bad. Well, some of it's bad, but mostly it's normal. The people want what they want, and bad games coverage is part of that. That said, it didn't used to be this way. If anything, the traditional gaming media that I grew up with, magazines and early websites and such, could be accused of being overly positive to the point where they could feel like marketing tools for the industry they were meant to be critiquing. But everything changed when the internet grew up and started producing media of its own. In the early days of gaming video reviews, nothing was more popular than being angry at bad games. Some people were angry at old games, some at new games, some at popular games, some at obscure games, some were angry in other languages, some were angry at the industry, and some reviewers were so angry they even put it in their name. I mean, why not? It was the most important part of their brand. Of course, a lot of this was just the influence of one man who came before and did the job better than pretty much anyone else. James Rolfe, the angry video game nerd, is a man whose influence on gaming content creation cannot be understated. Maybe you don't watch the angry video game nerd, maybe you never have, but if you watch any gaming YouTube content, then I guarantee you are either watching someone inspired by AVGN, or you're watching someone who was inspired by someone who was inspired by AVGN. James combined retro game reviews with a foul-mouthed, short-tempered persona to take viewers back to the past to play shitty games that sucked ass. And it was a winning formula. And so, the era of the angry reviewer took off, where the angrier the reviewer was, the better, and through this, the negativity traditional gaming media had neglected was, in a way, counterbalanced.
Cowabunga. Cow a fucking piece of dog shit. This game is diarrhea coming out of my dick.
To me, the Silent Hill series is over, and if Silent Hill 5 convinces me otherwise, then I will remove 3 of my own vertebrae, curl my spine back, and eat my own arse.
Betrayal!
What?
Betrayal! Betrayed me! This game sucks!
It was soon obvious that there was an audience for people willing to attack the industry, or popular games and series, because this was something traditional gaming media had long shied away from, and some content creators in particular were pretty good at this. But, as is so often the case, time marched on and fashions changed, and being angry on the internet went from cool to uncool. And yet, negativity didn't go anywhere. It was the style that changed more than the subject matter, and as the gaming content ecosystem grew, so too did the targets and the rhetoric. Because negativity sells. Say what you like about YouTubers, but they do love to give their audience what they want, and often, people want blood. And no target is easier to make bleed than a bad game. Unlike, say, criticizing a person, bad games don't ever respond to you, meaning you can say whatever you like. Bad games also don't tend to have fan bases who care about them, making criticizing them uncontroversial. Writing a negative script is also often more enjoyable than a positive one, and I certainly think criticizing is easier than praising. And hell, you can even use bad games to support whatever political beliefs you want to push. Maybe all of life's problems can be blamed on bad games if you try hard enough. I mean, I don't know why the stock market fell in 2022, but that was the year the new Saints Row came out, and I don't think that can just be coincidence. Bad games are punching bags, and perhaps more importantly, they're often fun punching bags. We do love a story. Redemption or ruin, it doesn't really matter. And bugs are amusing. Downfalls are tragic. Memes make us laugh, and great content is made from bad games. So why shouldn't something good come out of them? And why shouldn't people watch this type of content? Bad games are often symbolic of problems within the industry now, so there's good reason to care about them. Bad game coverage is normal, sometimes necessary, and usually harmless. But can we at least agree that there is a lot of exaggeration involved? I mean, Starfield might not be the game of the year, and plenty of people were likely disappointed, but does anyone really think it's this bad? Starfield is outdated and overrated. Starfield has no soul. Bethesda have terrible writing. Starfield has the worst story ever. Starfield is an overrated piece of shit. Starfield is a total disaster. Starfield is the worst RPG to ever exist. Starfield is a galactic disappointment. Starfield is creatively bankrupt, and so on and so on. I do wonder if even the people saying these things deep down truly believe them. I really can't tell anymore. I thought Starfield was alright. You know, a 7 out of 10 kind of game, pretty much what's to be expected from Bethesda, although better than their last game. Still, at least it took several creative risks and was impressive in its ambition, even if that didn't turn out that well, and it's nice to see a new IP from such a big studio, because that's a thing that's becoming increasingly rare these days. Mostly though, Starfield seemed like a game that's not worth caring that much about. There's no aggressive monetization, no scandals around mistreatment of workers, it's not that buggy or unfinished compared to the low bar of its genre, there's nothing interesting politically about it, it's not from a developer who is just milking their profitable franchises to death, or just pumping out games as quickly as possible to maximize profit, or chasing the latest bandwagon, or targeting an entirely new audience. It's just a game. It's alright. But it feels a bit like we exist in a world where nothing is allowed to be just okay anymore. Everything's either a masterpiece or a total disaster, with no in between. Which actually lines up well with most user reviews for games, where the two most common scores are 10 and 0. Scores that under a normal standard distribution should really be the least common. But user reviews generally aren't trying to be accurate. Instead, they're trying to influence the score of something in one direction or the other, where extremes are the best way to do that. And YouTube video essays on why not terrible game is actually terrible don't seem designed to be that accurate either. They seem designed to be as negative as possible because that's what's profitable, that's what stands out, that's what's easy, and sometimes that's what's fun. I'm not saying any of this content is bad. It makes sense why YouTube is the way it is. Negativity sells, and so negativity is exaggerated, more and more and more, again and again and again. But maybe this means bad games aren't quite as bad as we're led to believe. The Lord of the Rings, Gollum, is not a good game. But is it the worst game of all time, as it has sometimes been called? Well, the thing about games on this level of badness is that they get a lot of attention, and yet very few people actually play them, and so instead of people forming opinions from their own experiences, everyone instead just relies on reviewers, who do have an incentive to exaggerate. I mean, there's a reason so many people choose to use their limited time to play and cover games like this, instead of others they know are better. It's because badness can be mined for content, and the worse the game is, the better that content tends to be, and the better it tends to perform. So that's why I decided to complete The Lord of the Rings Gollum for myself, to see just how bad a 34 out of 100 on Metacritic game really is, and just how accurate these reviews are. And guess what? It was pretty bad. But was it 34 out of 100 bad? Well, yeah, maybe, at least when you consider that the version I played had been patched and so is meant to be less buggy and more stable than it was at launch, and considering how buggy and unstable it still is, I could see a 3.5 being a pretty reasonable score. Of course, determining the difference between a 34 out of 100 game and, say, a 44 out of 100 game would be pretty difficult in the first place, and Metacritic is far from perfect to begin with scores generally being overly inflated, which squishes most games together in the 70s and 80s region and makes a disparity between extremes more misleading and harder to judge. But regardless, there's no debate over whether Gollum is a bad game. The frame rate in particular is awful, even with a high-end PC and avoiding the highest settings, and you can't get more objectively bad than regular frame drops. Still, there are plenty of other problems. The presentation is inconsistent, and even at the best of times can look rather dated, with awkward character and facial animations, and pretty awful lighting effects. Some things also go beyond being bad to being just unfinished, like the death animations, which you will see a lot of, and yet sometimes don't even seem to be included, with the game instead just quietly bringing up the game over screen as if even it's embarrassed about what's happening. Meanwhile, the gameplay is arguably even worse. The biggest inspiration seems to have been Uncharted, which is a strange series to try to emulate for a game about Gollum, who doesn't exactly seem like a good fit for being gaming's next Nathan Drake. Outside of platforming, there is very basic stealth, a range of hilariously awkward action set pieces, mixed quality puzzles which occasionally aren't bad but are mostly just straightforward, and a lot, and I do mean a lot, of filler fetch quest-like objectives that just seem to exist to pad the runtime, which is quite long, by the way. Of course, that isn't really a good thing when the game isn't enjoyable, but it does show a certain level of intent to try and make a good game. And Gollum does have intent, more so than many other bad games it might be compared to, which I think is what makes the entire situation so interesting to people. Gollum isn't an out-and-out terrible game. Instead, it's an average game trapped inside an ugly little deformed goblin body. Presentation is bad, but it does show promise, with some environments looking quite striking and showing off a strong artistic flair, particularly the Elven sections in the game's second half. The voice acting is also mostly good, including Gollum himself, who is not an easy character to portray, although this is rather brought down by the animations and character models that support it. The soundtrack, on the other hand, is legitimately good, and could comfortably support a much better game. Meanwhile, gameplay is bad, but in a bland and inoffensive way, and it does at least try to create a varied experience, even if this ultimately just makes it a game that is bad at multiple different things, rather than just one. And then there is the story, which has several interesting ideas. Take the game's morality system, a spin on the classic good-bad binary that seemed so popular at the end of the 2000s, except here the choice is between the character's more evil Gollum and more innocent Smeagol personas, where the player not only makes their own choice, but also has to persuade the other personality, which you sometimes fail at. And losing an argument to the voice in your head and then having to watch this character do the exact opposite of what you want him to do really makes you feel like Gollum. The way the story is framed as Gollum recounting his capture and escape from Mordor to a grumpy Gandalf is also a nice touch. And as for the story itself, it isn't terrible, not really anyway, and certainly not considering the quality of the rest of the experience. The day-to-day events which make up so much of the game are not exactly exciting, and while casting Gollum as a mistreated prisoner is a good way to create sympathy for this potentially unsympathetic protagonist, the prison sections still feel like they lack the punch needed to really sell the dire situation these characters are in. Where I think the game does succeed somewhat, however, is in Gollum's relationships with the game's supporting characters. Gollum's flawed and withered morality makes him interesting in his own right, but throughout this game he also helps and works with a range of different people, and yet there's always a tension in these relationships. These aren't Gollum's friends, and you never know who you can trust or when and where everything is going to go wrong, creating an enjoyable unpredictability. The best of these characters by far is Mel, a blind elven outcast who needs Gollum's help just as Gollum needs her, and you never know whether her kindness is genuine, or whether Gollum is capable of sincerely returning such an emotion, and yet it's hard not to start rooting for the two of them anyway. And as for the ending of this game, well, the ending might be genuinely good, and I mean that. Now, I am about to spoil the finale of Gollum game, so if you don't want to know how this gripping tale concludes, you'd best stop watching or skip ahead and go play it yourself. It's only $50 on Steam. What a steal of your money. Anyway, during Gollum's time in Mordor, he hatches and befriends a small bird that he names Little One. Gollum uses Little One as a tool, firstly to do the bidding of his master, the Candleman, and then as a way to finally escape Mordor. After this, Gollum then gets captured again and ends up a prisoner of the Elves of Mirkwood, where life is better, even though he still longs to be free to pursue his precious. In time, however, an orc army somehow finds the hidden elven kingdom, and as the orcs attack, Gollum is once more reunited with Little One, suggesting that Gollum's bird might be the one responsible for leading the orcs here, because this is a bird of Mordor, and as the movies and game both show, birds are used as Sauron's spies. The final set piece has Gollum confronting the Candleman, but just before he can finally kill the one who has used him so much, Gollum's position is given away once more by Little One. And so, Gollum is betrayed again, not only by all the people in his miserable life, but even by the very bird that he hatched and cared for, his one and only friend. Except he's not, as before the Candleman can shoot, Little One defends Gollum, saving his life and proving that whether Little One is an accidental spy of Sauron or not, he does at least care for the one who raised him. After this, Gollum finally gets his freedom, with the last moral choice in the game being whether to kill Little One or not. And it's not an easy choice. While Little One lives, Gollum may never truly be free of the reach of the Dark Lord, and yet Little One might be the only living creature in the entire world that genuinely cares for Gollum, his one and only friend. There is a little more to the ending than this, but this is what I think is the good part. It's worth pointing out, but the game starts with Gollum chasing after a different bird that is spying on him near Mordor, and it's because of this bird that Gollum gets captured to begin with, giving the narrative a certain circular quality. It's also worth pointing out that there are parallels between Little One and Gollum. They're both small, weak creatures who need to rely on others to survive. They both don't really understand what's going on around them. They're both used by greater powers as tools, and they both represent innocence and corruption at the hands of the Dark Lord. Except, unlike with most of Gollum's relationships, this time there is a role reversal, and Gollum is the one with power, the one using someone else, and the one ultimately deciding the other's fate. I say all this not to prove that Gollum has a good story or that it's some underappreciated gem, but just to show that this game did have potential, and that there is evidence of this in the final product. This is not a terrible game, it's part terrible game and part valiant effort. And ultimately, the bad does comfortably outweigh the good, but the fact that the good is there at all proves that somebody tried. This isn't just a cynical cash grab that did the bare minimum. This isn't a representation of the industry's worst problems. This game isn't going to trick many unsuspecting customers into buying it, and its lack of quality will not endanger the rest of the industry. Gollum is simply an honest attempt to make a good game that ended in failure. Which happens. Developer Daedalic Entertainment were a small studio best known for a series of niche point-and-click adventure games who also found success working with and publishing other indie titles. Gollum was their first attempt to create a higher budget game, but they were still working with a fraction of the resources that most major games have. For example, Daedalic had, prior to recent layoffs, around 90 employees, but many of these would have likely been working in the publishing division, meaning the number of developers to work on Gollum is likely considerably less. Meanwhile, AAA games tend to have staff numbers starting in the hundreds that can extend well into the thousands. Gollum also had a budget of 15 million euros, while AAA games would tend to have a budget starting at around $200 million, as well as marketing costs that can be more than that of the actual game. So maybe Daedalic were wrong to even try and should have just known their place, but surely no one believes that as a general rule. Because a small niche developer targeting progressively more ambitious and higher budget games while gradually expanding their development team is exactly the route that another now rather acclaimed studio called Larian did with Divinity Original Sin 1, Divinity Original Sin 2, and then their attempt at a true AAA game using a popular pre-existing license, Baldur's Gate 3. So if you think developers shouldn't try to make progressively more ambitious and higher budget games, then say goodbye to Baldur's Gate 3, or The Witcher 3, or others, because that is the path they took. But sometimes it goes right, and sometimes it goes wrong. Failure happens, and in the modern gaming market, failure is usually harmless, at least to consumers. Hell, you could even say that because games this bad lead to so much widely consumed good content, that they actually create a net positive in the world. And, even the angriest of reviewers kind of look like they might be having a good time with the game at times. And yet, instead of being treated as harmless and a normal part of an industry that is going to produce a wide range of games, some good, some bad, we seem to treat examples like this as a personal attack on all of gamers, as if the developer has done something morally wrong by daring to make a game so bad.
Daedalic, come here. Right here, right now.
What the fuck?
This is the contempt that they show for you guys now, the gamers.
Every once in a while, a game comes along that's so disgraceful in its launch that it shames the entire medium of gaming. That, ladies and gentlemen, is The Lord of the Rings Gollum.
I severely underestimated Daedalic. Daedalic my balls!
Bad games should be criticized, and they certainly can be mocked, but they shouldn't be hated. It's not personal. Some games are bad. The correct response is to not buy them, and to tell other people to not buy them, and of course, no pre-orders. But I don't think situations like this justify anger. Developers don't want to make a bad game, and something this bad could not be easily fixed by a few more delays. Gollum is admittedly overpriced and has terrible DLC, but even then, I don't think you can blame a developer or publisher for trying to salvage what they can from failure of this magnitude. Jobs are on the line in these types of situations, and those in charge probably should be doing whatever they think is best for their companies' and employees' survival. What's more, while YouTubers sometimes voice their opinions quite strongly, this always seems to get taken even further by random people on the internet. And I have to say, if you are going to the effort to hunt down developers or voice actors for a game you dislike to leave hate comments on their social media, you are too invested in the situation. And I say this for your sake as much as theirs. Many YouTube reviews do also portray this game in a rather misleading way. Gollum is bad, and maybe it is 34 out of 100 bad, but it's still not as bad as a review that cherry-picks its worst moments makes it seem. It's also not the worst game of all time. In fact, it doesn't even come close. Nor is it the worst game of the year, and compared to the terrible games I played in my childhood, it's in many ways really not that bad at all. I remember buying games that were just reskins of some older game and had nothing to do with what was advertised on the box, as well as games that barely ran at all. For a young kid with limited funds who can only get a few new games a year, bad games were genuinely deadly. But that isn't the case anymore. A lot of bad games these days are harmless, and maybe that should be reflected in the way we treat them. Most of the best known bad games are probably not as bad as their reputation makes them seem. There is an incentive to exaggerate and be overly negative, and the same can't be said about being positive and going against dominant opinion. Ergo, exaggeration and negativity wins. This is mostly a modern trend, but it's not like this didn't happen even before the internet took off. No game has been called the worst of all time more than E.T. And yet, no one who is at least slightly informed actually believes this is true. For one thing, E.T. was fully playable, but it also had a lot of genuinely ambitious and innovative ideas, and its original critical reception wasn't even that negative, with it still receiving multiple positive reviews. And finally, there are many bad Atari 2600 games, some of which are obviously worse than E.T. But E.T. being the worst game of all time was a good story. One game so bad it crashed the entire industry and destroyed Atari, with millions of unsold copies ending up dumped in a landfill in the middle of a desert. It is a good story. And that is bad games. They are the scapegoats, symbols, and story generators of the industry. And in today's day and age, bad games are profitable. Just not for the people who actually make them. But this video isn't really about bad games, it's about our obsession with them. So the real question then is this a problem? Great content is made from bad games, important issues are highlighted through them, and little harm seems to be done as a result. It's a win-win situation where the only loser is someone who has already lost. And this is what the people want. So, why does it kind of bother me? Bad games coverage isn't based on lies, but it does distort the truth. And to me at least, I think this does matter. I know this isn't one of the world's most pressing problems. I get completely why this happens. I don't blame anyone for taking part, and I enjoy a lot of this content myself. But I still think people, i.e. YouTube viewers, should at least be aware of how the sausage gets made. And I still think that even bad games, even the worst, deserve a fair chance. Also, while bad games can highlight bigger problems, there's also a risk of the message being diluted if every bad game is met with anger and hatred. Some bad games symbolize important issues, but some don't, and it's worth differentiating between the two so that anger can be focused on where it counts, lest we all become gamer boys crying wolf. Furthermore, I'm not sure a culture where we respond to failure with anger and hatred is such a good thing in the first place. Creating things is hard. Do you know what happens to most things people create? Nothing. Nothing happens because most people never share their creations with the world. Creating things is hard, and it can be particularly hard to keep going in spite of that, and to deal with the constant fear of failure, and the prospect of disappointing yourself or other people, and the pain of not making something as good as you want it to be and believe yourself capable of. Creating things is hard. And if we're being honest, most creations that never see the light of other people's eyes probably do suck. But there are exceptions. Franz Kafka destroyed the vast majority of his work due to self-doubt, and none of his famous novels were published until after his death, when his friend went against his will to share his remaining work rather than destroy it. Kafka ended up as one of the most widely celebrated writers of the 20th century, yet in his eyes, his work wasn't even good enough to show anyone. I think this kind of fear of failure and self-doubt probably holds many people back in life, and that's a great shame, because the number one way to make something good is usually to fail a bunch of times. Unless you're very lucky, failure is the best teacher you will ever have. Failure is useful, failure is necessary, and failure is normal. It is a part of creation, and if we want people to create good things, games or otherwise, failure should probably be allowed. So maybe we should avoid vilifying it. No one wants to make a bad game. Game development isn't a career people choose for the money. They choose it because they're attracted to the idea of making something good that others will enjoy. If they then invest years of their lives alongside much blood, sweat and tears, only to see that the end result of their work is a game that sucks, which no one likes, then that is probably punishment enough. The hate and anger is unnecessary, and going beyond disliking the game to disliking the people involved is clearly taking things too far. This is admittedly a complicated topic. Harsh criticism can produce better results, and the line that represents going too far is not always clear. But I think of it a bit like being in a relationship. If there is a problem in your relationship, the correct thing to do is speak up, express how you feel, and try to find a solution. But if expressing how you feel involves things like screaming and shouting, then you're probably doing more harm than good, even if you happen to be correct. Consumers should express how they feel, but they shouldn't be toxic about it. And feedback is useful, but abuse isn't. To me, the best bad game content tends to be the more comedic stuff anyway. And it's also worth remembering that the OG angry reviewer was playing a character, where his anger was a part of the joke and not genuinely directed at the makers of the games. In summary, I guess what I'm saying with this video is that bad games really aren't so bad. Depending on what you mean by bad. Thank you for watching. Hello, I hope everyone is doing well. I'm not sure when this video will be live, but it should be sometime festively. So I hope you're enjoying yourself, or that you have enjoyed yourself, or that you will enjoy yourself, whichever fits. This video was actually really difficult to make. This was not a smooth journey, which is a bit ironic considering how a lot of this video focuses on failure. But there were rewrites and re-recordings, and a lot of invested time trying to improve this thing that I wasn't happy with. And I think I did it, although you might disagree, which is fine, but I feel I got there in the end. Creating things is hard, but as far as I can tell, it is worth it to keep going. Anyway, I guess I will see you all in the new year. Something Patreon something. Bye.